name is Leah Sofer, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex.
U.S. warships and planes launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
After years of devastating cuts, we're now rebuilding our military like we never have before.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Thank You for Your Service, a hard look at American civil military affairs from the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. I'm Nick Pereso.
And I'm Thomas Krasnation.
Today we're excited to bring you an interview we recorded a few weeks ago with retired U.S. Army General Stanley McChrystal. General McChrystal graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1976, and he served until 2010. In 2009, President Barack Obama appointed General McChrystal to lead the International Security Assistance Force, commanding all U.S. and NATO troops in Afghanistan. He served in this role for a little over a year before an article was published in Rolling Stone magazine that portrayed General McChrystal and his team as disrespectful of senior Obama administration officials. President Obama immediately relieved him of command, and General McChrystal retired from the Army. Since then, he has taught courses at Yale University and started a consulting group. He has written several best-selling books on leadership, including his latest, Leaders, Myth, and Reality, and he's been in the news recently for his criticism of the current presidential administration.
Just one quick note before we get started with the interview. In this interview, you'll hear the word joint a bunch of times, as in the Joint Staff and Joint Special Operations Command. In the U.S. military, the word joint refers to the integrated and cooperative efforts of multiple different military branches, like the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. Before he became the International Security Assistance Force commander, General McChrystal famously commanded Joint Special Operations Command, which consists of several thousand troops from different military branches' elite special operations units, such as the Navy SEALs and the Army's Green Berets. At two other times in his career, General McChrystal worked for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, helping the military branches work together.
In the first part of this interview, we talked to General McChrystal about his time on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon during the period just prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, and some of the things he saw as failures in cooperation between civilian and military policymakers. But we'll get to that later. Here's the interview.
General Stanley McChrystal, thank you so much for joining us on Thank You for Your Service. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, it's my pleasure.
We've been really excited for this interview for a while, not just because you're a near-legendary Army general, but because also in retirement, you've really established yourself as a thoughtful scholar. Over the past few years, you've published best-selling books and have become well-known as a writer on history and leadership. What would you say
Nick,
has...
Near legendary means almost dead. So,
What would you say has most surprised you about the transition from the military to a more academic role?
Yeah, separate from the academic, sort of the commercial or non-military world, it's how similar they are. You know, we have uniforms, we have ranks in the military, and we perceive the military and the civilian world as being dramatically different. And actually, it's all people. So the similarities were the big surprise for me.
So during your career, you were well known within the Army as a combat commander, especially of Joint Special Operations Command. But you also served in some policymaking roles at the Pentagon. And we were wondering if you could talk a little bit about your time on the Joint Staff during the lead up to the Iraq War and what you observed about the civil-military interaction at that time with regards to war policymaking.
Yeah, no, that's great. I entered the Joint Staff when I left Afghanistan in the late summer of 2002. And that was my first tour in the Pentagon. So I had no experience at that level before arriving. And that was clearly a disadvantage for me. I had to learn how the Joint Staff worked. And I also had to learn the whole culture of the Pentagon, how that worked as well. A few of the things that I noticed at the very beginning. First, the Joint Staff is a superb collection of military professionals. There had been a period a couple of decades before when, in fact, some of the staffs, like Joint Staffs, didn't get the best people. But the Goldwater-Nichols Act in 1986 changed that dramatically. So, in fact, the Joint Staff is this collection of extraordinary talent. Now, having said that, though, the Pentagon's a funny place. You have the OSD staff, or the staff of the Secretary of Defense, and they are really responsible for the lead in policy making. The Joint Staff, a lot of people don't understand, is involved in coordination of execution through the different military services and through the combatant commanders. And the roles between those two staffs are not always clear. And then you layer on top of that just personalities and whatnot. I arrived during the tenure of Donald Rumsfeld. And a few of the things I noticed first was there really wasn't a very good relationship between the military leadership and Secretary Rumsfeld and the people around him. Part of it was Secretary Rumsfeld's style. You know, he had sometimes a difficult style. Sometimes it was the people around him. And part of it was the military as well. I remember there were things that I saw Secretary Rumsfeld do and the way he operated that I thought hindered conversation between the military, effective interaction between the military. And I would say that I arrived in that late summer of 2002, and that was just when planning for the invasion of Iraq had gotten serious. And I didn't think it was very effective. I didn't think there was an ongoing dialogue between senior military and senior Department of Defense or other parts of the government about whether we should do this. There was an awful lot of talk about the mechanics of it, moving this there or, troops or things. But I don't ever remember the kinds of discussions where that said, why would we do this? If we do this, what will be the second and third order effects and how will we deal with those? So I actually think it was a failure of policymaking, effective policymaking, because those dialogues, in my perception, didn't occur to the depth that they needed to. And clearly what bore out in Iraq shows that we didn't get deep enough into some of those things. At the same time, you can't point the finger one way or another here, because I think the military is at least as responsible as the civilian side was. There's one anecdote I'd tell you. At one point, Secretary Rumsfeld is talking about how the invasion would be conducted, the flow of forces. And the military leadership said, okay, we will flow according to an existing operational plan and a TIPFID, time phase deployment document, which has a list of the sequence in which you deploy forces, very complex documents that get everything to the right port and then onto the right shipping and whatnot. And the military said, okay, Secretary Rumsfeld, if you want to do this, it's a binary decision. You basically say, go, no go, and then we execute this plan. And the secretary said, no, I don't want to do that. That's not the force package I want to send. I want to send a completely different force package in a completely different sequence. And the military, and I was in some of the closed door, had a very difficult time with that. Senior leaders said, well, it's too complex to try to rejigger things. If we don't stick with the plan, we'll screw it all up. And then there'd be all the military would link arms and say, okay, we're going to go in and tell Secretary Rumsfeld, I'm sorry, but this is what you have to do. They would do that, and he would say, I'm sorry, that's not what I'm going to do. Go away, come back with a new plan. And this went on for several weeks until finally, he sort of stuffed them on the deal. Mm-hmm. And, he turned out to be right. He turned out the military could change it. They could send things in different order. They could be that adaptable when he forced them to be. And that was one of those cases where you had two pretty strong cultures fighting, both thinking they were right. But at the end of the day, the outcome, I think people learned from it. But it just shows that inside that building, things are sometimes difficult.
Right. So kind of the classic theory of civil-military relations laid out by Samuel Huntington is that the military and civilian policy officials, they live in these separate spheres, that the politicians set strategic objectives and then the military carries them out. Would you say, therefore, that based on your experience, that Huntingtonian framework is incomplete?
Yeah, that's the right direction, because when Sam Huntington wrote that, I remember he described the military as technicians. that the policymaker would say we want a bicycle, and the military would go build the bicycle and whatnot. But the reality is that's not realistic in what I think how things need to work, because the military have there's a bleed over. I mean, there's huge overlap between politics and military operation because each affects the other so much. So that if the military people sort of stay in a hermetically sealed tube and say, you decide what you want, and then we'll execute it, is unrealistic, because the act of executing military operations changes things on the ground. It affects policy. It's just that way. And similarly, policy affects military operations in the execution. So it's not a case of where you have policy decision, stop, turn it over to the military, and then stop, turn it back to the policymakers. It is intertwined the entire time, and it must be. That means that military leaders necessarily have to understand, and they need to be adept at dealing to an appropriate level in that policymaking. I mean, this is art here. This is military. Look at George C. Marshall, people like that. They developed a sense for how much they should be involved there. And then people like, well, he was also commander-in-chief, but Franklin Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln, how much they should get involved in actually directing military operations. So this is one of these things. It's not black and white, it's gray, and it necessarily must be.
So about 7 years after the U.S. first committed troops to the war in Afghanistan, you took command of the troops there, the International Security Assistance Force. We were wondering if you could talk a little bit about the situation you found when you first arrived in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I had been there first as the chief of staff for JTF 180 in 2002. And then because Joint Special Operations Command, my command in that had been spread across the region, I'd spent part of every year between 2002 and 2009 in Afghanistan. So I had a fair amount of familiarity. But clearly when I came in as the ISAF commander, that's a different role. I had to take on a different perspective. What I found was interesting and disappointing. The first was, this was about 8 years in. I got there in June 2009. And the level of activity had not produced much real change, meaning we had talked at the beginning after the fall of 2001 about working on the Afghan court system, the Afghan military, the Afghan police, and different nations had said they'd take the lead to do that, and almost nothing had been done. So in reality, the military wasn't really out of the starting gates, neither were the courts and neither were the police. The Afghan people, who had great high hopes when we first got there in 2001 with the fall of the Taliban regime, were now disappointed, almost to the point of cynicism, that says, you've had Western troops here, you've had a certain amount of fighting. It's not gotten better materially. I mean, some things had. There were kids in school and all, but the reality was the improvements were much less than their hopes and expectations had been. So there was a crisis in that. And there was a crisis in competence because they didn't think that we were going to stay, or that we had proven that we could produce the kind of outcome that we needed. When you looked at the NATO effort, one of the first things that struck me was the lack of consistency. I showed up and met with President Karzai, and I was the 10th ISAF commander. So 9 before me had been there. And he rightfully could look at me and say, how long are you going to be here? And look at his watch. And so there's every reason to think we don't take it seriously. The sense of professionalism on the American side, but really the whole ISAF thing, was kind of junior varsity. And it's not because it was bad people, but not only had more troops and more equipment and more technology gone to the fight in Iraq, which had been much more challenging for many years, everything that went to Afghanistan was less or a little backwards. So our communication structure, our force structure, and even in the staff, the ISAF staff, it was very heavily individual augmentees. And they were good people, but it wasn't units, and it wasn't the first string. And so when you got there, it wasn't surprising that they were able to produce less with less. It just, you're going to get a less effective outcome. So we needed